As a landlord, there are many things that can warrant sending out a notice. Some of them include unauthorized pets, late rent payments, or unpaid fees. Another case, which is not very common, is issuing a notice of abandonment. How and when to issue a notice of abandonment to your tenants. If you're not sure what a notice of abandonment is, keep watching. In this video, we will be going over what a notice of abandonment is, as well as what constitutes the sending of one. We will even provide you with a free template for you to use yourself. You can find it on that link right below, right there in the description, okay? And after you do that, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button if you haven't. So, let's get started. What is a notice of abandonment? A notice of abandonment is a written notice that is issued when a tenant abandons a property or when the property is deemed abandoned. This basically means that the tenant leaves the property before the end of the lease agreement without notifying the landlord. When this happens, there's a process that must be followed before being able to reoccupy the rental property. This process involves more than just giving the lessor written notice of abandonment, and if not done correctly, it could even lead to a lawsuit. The first thing that must be done when you suspect that the tenant's property has been abandoned is to display a notice on the property where it can clearly be seen, like the front door or things like that. The notice should state that the tenant has abandoned the property and has a limited time to return. By doing this, the landlord is protected from unlawfully evicting the tenant and cannot face a lawsuit. Keep in mind that this notice must also be sent through certified mail to any addresses associated with the tenant. You then need to give the tenant 5 business days to respond before moving on with the eviction. To proceed as quickly as possible, most landlords choose first-class mail. However, it is important to realize when a landlord or property manager is actually allowed to issue this notice. In this next section, let's go over some of the things that can lead to the issuing of a notice of abandonment. When to serve a notice of abandonment. Before you decide if a property has been abandoned, there are a few steps that should be taken. Taking these steps will allow you to ensure that the tenant has actually abandoned the property and that you can proceed with any other actions. The first step is to consider whether the tenancy has ended or has expired. If the tenancy has expired, then you do not have to worry about abandonment. It simply means that the tenant has reached the end of the lease term and has left the property. Pretty simple. At this point, the tenant stops paying rent and simply moves out of the property, terminating the tenancy. Very straightforward. Now, if you discover that the tenant has simply moved out of the rental property with no notice and before the lease expires, you may be dealing with abandonment. If you see that the tenant has not entered the property for 7 days and they did not pay rent for 10 days, you can issue the notice. But if you notice that the possessions are missing from the property, the conditions change. You can issue the notice after only 5 days of the tenant being gone and 5 days of rent not being paid. At this point, the lessor's notice has been issued, and if the lessee fails to respond, they can get evicted. Okay, so now that we know when landlords are able to issue these notices, let's go over some of the things that should always be included in a notice of abandonment. What to include in a notice of abandonment. After deciding whether to issue the notice of abandonment or not, it is time to actually begin writing one. As with any notice, you should always provide some sort of introduction. This should include your name, a postal address, and the date. It should also include all of the same information for the tenant. Then, you should include a short statement explaining what the notice is for. It should be straightforward and explain exactly the purpose of the notice. Reasoning. After the introduction, the landlord should include a section explaining the reasoning behind sending the notice, of course. Since this is a notice of abandonment, the reasoning will usually be pretty general. For example, you can put that the tenant has not been present in the property for a number of days and that there are little or no belongings present. Or you can put that the tenant has been absent and that there is absolutely no reasonable evidence that the tenant is still living there. It is very important that you choose the reasoning wisely because it could be disputed in court by the tenant. Legal information. It is important that you include a section on the legal information pertaining to abandonment in your particular state. This is vital because the tenant must know which law or statute they're violating when receiving the notice. Also, you must check your local and state laws to make sure you're including enough information about the legality of the abandonment. After that, you can include the information about the consequences of the tenant's actions. This means that the landlord should include information about what would happen if the tenant does not respond. Landlords usually include a time frame here of how long the tenant has to respond before they get evicted. Posting information. Finally, since it is so important that the tenant gets a hold of this notice, a section about where the notice was posted should also be included. This section is mostly to protect the landlord from lawsuits. These lawsuits can happen when the landlord doesn't properly alert the tenant about the abandonment and the consequences. Some forms of transmission include certified mail or first-class mail posted on the property, or personally delivered. Then, to finish it off, the landlord will include their signature and the date. Free template. Want to get your hands on a free template that you can use yourself? Simply visit DoorLoop's resources page. There's a link right there in the description, right here, all right? Where you can easily find a template for the notice of abandonment and a lot of content on how to manage rental property, tenant screening, and much, much more. And as always, happy renting.